Welcome to Book Talks with Colors of Influence. I am your host, Maylene Hamto. I am an avid reader and reviewer of books for my book blog, Colors of Influence, and I also review books for outlets and platforms such as City Books, Hollow Hollow Review, Book Sirens, Readsy, and the Nonfiction Authors Association. So Book Talks focuses on fiction and nonfiction works that highlight issues of diverse identities, equity and inclusion, social justice, indigenous ways of being, and decolonial approaches to the struggle for liberation. I talk to authors whose works contribute to a nuanced understanding of various cross-cultural contexts of our shared humanity and common dreams. The works featured in this web series reveal essential truths about the author's unique perspectives. So in this episode, I am so honored to be joined by Destyn Land, who is the author of The Rules We Live By, Stories and Reflections on Unlearning Patriarchal Masculinity. In this timely and deeply introspective book, Destyn examines the nature of masculinity and the lessons boys and men are taught as children, which carry into their adult lives. So although the target audience is male identified readers, the book is very relevant to people of all genders. Through recollections and reflections from his own experiences, Destyn challenges readers to unpack the cultural norms that we may have absorbed about traditional pictures of the ideal masculine figure. So Destyn is a native of Minnesota in the historically Black neighborhood of Rondo in St. Paul. And in both his book and his podcast, Destyn talks about his experiences as a boy, not quite fitting in. And these experiences fed his lifelong quest to create space for different ways that masculinity can manifest outside the confines of traditions. In 2022, Destyn launched the Rethinking Manhood podcast, which is a space for men and masculine individuals to unlearn patriarchal masculinity and to heal and grow and learn together in community. So I reviewed Destyn's book, The Rules We Live. Interview. The power of Land, Destyn Land's narrative is his laser focus on his target audience, men and boys who may feel out of place in traditional societal norms, but have no choice but to conform. So he delivers information and advice about harmful structures and promotes understanding in humanizing others. And there were other reviews that echoed the same sentiments, right? So one reader wrote, Destyn's vulnerability is hyper-specific to his own journey, while simultaneously being universally valuable to anyone who takes the time to read. This book ought to be savored, consumed, explored, and shared. Thank you, Destyn, for penning what I believe will be the catalyst for the freedom and self-discovery of many, wrote another reader. So welcome, Destyn. It is such an honor to have you on Book Talks.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And thank you for that amazing introduction. I was like, wow, we're talking about me right now.
Absolutely. And again, thank you for your grace about making sure that we have everything together today and kind of understanding. But so let us go jump right in. So this is such an important book because the conversation about patriarchy is so timely. It has been timely, even more so today. And you have been among the most ardent voices calling for men to fully engage in this work, right?
Mhm.
From your perspective, what is the significance of publishing this book at this time?
Yeah, it's interesting that you asked that because I think after the results of the election and just kind of watching things politically unfold in our country, this book has a different importance. And I think about the rise of red pill masculinity. That might be a phrase that many people aren't familiar with, but it's really this form of masculinity that a lot of younger men are embracing that has a lot of beliefs around women, them seeking after money and power and material things. But also there's this whole thing around alpha males and beta males. So being reclaiming power, reclaiming like this hegemonic masculinity. And it's scary. It's scary. I think that one of the things that led me to this work and to write this book is when I think about the impacts of patriarchy and patriarchal masculinity. I really believe that these things are harming all of us in our community. Of course, we know that this harms women and non-gender conforming folks in direct ways. I mean, I think it is rare to meet a person who identifies as a woman who has not been harmed by patriarchy. But it even harms men as well too. And if we don't address it, I think we have to see that it is something that will eventually kill us all. I often like to say explicitly. We can see that through the life expectancy of men, very connected to patriarchal masculinity. We can see that in male suicide rates, but also we see it just in how the characteristics of a patriarchal man are more aligned with violence and harm than they are love and care. So for me, the why now is really about if I think that it's important to create a world where everyone can be free, be well, and have everything that they need. I think that this is something we have to address to get there.
Yeah. And thank you again for pouring all of your, your energy and for this work, right? It's so important that men like you who understand the value of feminism, and you
Mhm, mhm,
about that in your book as well, are able to talk to other men about the harms of patriarchal masculinity, as you mentioned. And shifting gears a little bit, so in the book, you share your personal experiences and your reflections as a boy and as a man. And your body of work is inherently reflexive. And
mhm,
what's really powerful about this work is that you model for others how to look deeply into their experiences and how to
mhm, mhm,
understand themselves, and how their experiences may have impact the world, right, and continue to impact the world. And self-awareness is an important part of what makes your message really relatable and effective.
mhm.
So, what did you learn about yourself in the process of writing this book?
Oh my goodness, so much. One thing even before I get to that I'll mention is just how important reflection is. I think about, which I'm sure you're familiar with, experiential learning and how we can have so many experiences, but often the learning and the wisdom happens at the reflection of the experience. And one of the things that writing this book did for me was it gave me that space to reflect on the things that I experienced. Some of these things I had talked about for a while. And if you have been a listener of the podcast, you've probably heard some of these stories before. But some of these stories I've never told. And I think it was while I was writing and reflecting that um, just so much wisdom and learning was able to happen. An important thing that I learned about myself and a lesson about vulnerability is not just about what you put out there, but it's also about allowing people to receive it and respond to it, which was difficult. I think that there were things that I disclosed in this book that I had not disclosed to my family, to my parents, and I had to navigate that with them. I'm not able to just disclose this and say, okay, we're done here. But like, no, I have to engage with them. I have to allow them to ask questions. I have to allow them to wrestle with the text. And it was interesting how, for so many of these stories, I've been telling them for so long that they don't feel vulnerable. But yet, when I had to address them with family, I'm like, oh my gosh, I feel naked. Like, I feel like they know everything about me now. So that was something I learned. And then I think another thing that I observed from just people's response to the book is that it's just necessary. The amount of people I've met where this message resonates with them, and I think people are starting to interrogate all the rules that they live by, not just the rules associated with gender, but I think about for every identity that we hold, there is an imaginary rule book that we're given. In my Black identity, there was a rule book that I was given that says this is what Blackness is, and you need to be like this. In my faith and religion, I was given a rule book. And for every identity that I have, essentially, and I don't know if we always take the time to acknowledge these rules because these rules are shaping our life. I'll share one more thing because this response is probably getting long winded. But when I was learning how to drive, it took me a long time. It just did not click for me because I'm directionally challenged. Like I don't know how to get anywhere. I use the GPS to go places I've been thousands of times. When I was a kid, I remember driving in the car with my dad. I was maybe 12 years old, 12 or 13 years old. And my dad was asking me, he was doing this thing where he was trying to get me to pay attention to the street signs and knowing where to go. He asked me, tell me when you should make this turn at what street. And I said, well, wait a minute, I have to get closer to see the street sign. And that's when I realized I couldn't see well. So we went to the doctor, and my dad was shocked. And he was like, Dustin, why didn't you say that you couldn't see? Why didn't you tell us? And I told my dad something that I think was kind of profound. I said, I kind of just thought that everybody saw like me. I didn't think anyone could see that far. I assumed that everybody struggled reading the whiteboard at school. And the glasses that we wear, well, everybody doesn't wear glasses, but the lens that we have is very much informed by our identity and very much informed by these rules. And yet, when we start to critique and evaluate these rules, we realize, like, wait a minute, these things aren't real. Like, we kind of made them up, and yet they are shaping our entire outlook on life. And if we're not careful, we'll make the assumption that everyone else is following these same rules, whether that's related to racial identity, gender, orientation, or so much more. So I think these are just a bunch of things that came up for me as writing, where one, just seeing how much our ideas and beliefs about our identities have influence over our life, in this case, gender identity, understanding of masculinity, and how it's not just about the clothes that you wear, the cologne that you wear, or what section you shop in, but really about the values you have, the characteristics that you think you should embody, the way that you think you should give and receive love, all connected to it.
Yeah, appreciate that, Destin. And before I ask the next question, which is
Mhm.
my favorite part, because you'll be reading a section of your book, I just have a quick follow-up to what you mentioned about engaging your family in self-disclosure
Mhm.
about some
Mhm.
of the stories that they've never heard before. And I was just wondering, or things that they did not know about you. And are learning about from your writing.
Mhm.
I was just wondering how you were able to sort of emotionally and mentally prepare yourself for those hard conversations. So
Yeah, it's so interesting. Was working with a therapist while writing the book, and I think that was something we would talk about all the time. Where I knew that I was going to be disclosing things, and I would always ask him, "How do you think I should approach this? Like, what are some of the strategies I used?" Now he gave me a great plan to follow about like writing a letter around. I didn't follow any of that. I was so awkward about it that I randomly, when I got the proof copies of the book, I randomly just gave them a copy and I was like, "Hey y'all, I wrote a book. Check it out." But really, I think it was a moment where I had to practice what I preach. And I think it is so easy to say the right things, right? Like I think it is easy when you read the literature to know the right things to say. It is easy, not easy, but I mean, I think one of the things that has to happen is that it's not enough just to be aware, but that awareness has to inform your actions. And I realized that I can't go around talking about the importance of vulnerability and the importance of openness and honesty and then not want to do that. And now, not to say that I think we all have ownership over who we disclose things to and how. And I'm not saying that my family is obligated to know these things, but more so if I'm going to choose to engage them, I have to be open to their response. So it was hard. It wasn't always easy. And maybe I would even argue at times it felt like it created conflict. But what I'll also say about that is that the beautiful thing about that is that conflict often can lead to a deeper intimacy. And I think that when we look at conflict from a patriarchal lens, we see it as violent. We see it as something that leads to rupture, something that leads to discourse and, and disconnection. But conflict can be something that draws you closer to people. It can deepen your love. And I'm thankful that this book made me have some very important conversations with my dad and with my brother. And I think if it weren't for the messiness of conflict or the messiness of self disclosure, we wouldn't have been able to get there. So hopefully that answers.
Absolutely. Yeah. And again, appreciate, sort of that lens about, making sure that you have, the resources that you can draw upon to make sure that these conversations that these important conversations are engaged in a way that also uplifts you, right? That doesn't kind of take away so much. And the point that you made about conflict, deepening intimacy, deepening relationships definitely resonates quite a bit. And so, as you know, in my review, I mentioned that this book would be a great feature on book clubs for men around the country. So that's, I don't know if anybody will take my my word for it, being a woman, but and again, as I mentioned, this is my most favorite part of doing these interviews because it's so great to hear the authors like you share the words that they want the readers to remember fully, right? So, yeah, if you could read us a quick section of the book that really captures the essential takeaways.
Yes, yes. I'm gonna read something from the shame chapter, and it's the one of the opening chapters of the book. It's one of my favorite chapters because I think that when we're talking about patriarchal masculinity and one of its harms is that it really shames people. And I think for every expectation, or one of the things I say in the book, although this isn't the reading, but I say that for every issue that you find in this book, we will find shame somewhere, somewhere embedded in it. This is on page 29. It says here, masculinity functions like a rule book, dictating a code of conduct for men to follow. It dictates how one should speak, from the tone of one's voice to the words used. For so many years of my life, I would force my voice to be deeper when I was around other men. I would probably swear a bit more and make more sexually suggestive jokes because that's what I learned real men were supposed to do. According to this code of conduct, one is given guidance on how to walk. It is never okay for your hips to sway even slightly, and you never want your feet to hit the ground too gracefully, or you'd be considered soft. This imaginary book teaches us that we should keep a poker face and limit the expression of all emotions, except for anger or rage. When we don't meet the criteria, or if we're not man enough, we are told that there's something wrong with who we are, and that this something, no matter what it is, makes us unworthy of belonging and being loved. This is how shame manifests, and why shame often leads to insecurity and lack of self worth. When we internalize the belief that we are unworthy of love, we stop believing we deserve love from others. In one of my favorite novels, The Perks of Being a Wallflower, the main character, a freshman in high school, asks his English teacher why he and everyone he loves chose people who treat them as if they are insignificant after witnessing abuse in his older sister's relationship. The teacher responds with the most quoted line from the book: "We accept the love we think we deserve." When children are shamed for not fitting perfectly into masculine or feminine categories, which exist on a spectrum, they may struggle to see themselves as lovable, which has a serious impact on their social, emotional, and cognitive development. As I've studied youth development, I've found that our society is obsessed with raising young people to be miniature versions of someone else. We place our male children in Boy Scouts and sports programs and encourage them to engage in rough play because we want to ensure that they will be man enough to be one of the real men. A patriarchal parent's deepest worry for their boy child is centered around how masculine their son will be rather than how whole they will be. When we shift from how masculine to how whole, we shift from raising children to be who we want them to be and instead assist them in becoming who they already are. The challenge, however, is unlearning that who they are and who we are is shameful. I chose that section because I think one, it sets the foundation of how I got interested in this work was just being a boy, not fitting into a box, but also by trade and by heart, I'm a youth worker. And I think about how we always want young people to be something, and we want to be able to determine that something. And yet, when people say, "Okay, well, if we abolish these things, these terms, if we don't have rigid definitions of masculinity and femininity, who will our children become?" Well, they'll become themselves. They'll become probably their most whole self. They will become who they were created to be.
That's excellent. Thank you for sharing that excerpt, Destin. And as you were reading it, one thing that came up for me was, what is really relatable and important about your narrative is you are making the rules of masculinity really visible to others, right? Like we just take it as a given that this is how things are. But when
Mhm,
you pointed
mhm,
out, like, why do things have to be that way? And it cuts across different cultures, right? Like
mhm,
I grew up in the Philippines, in a completely different country, and a
mhm.
lot of what you read is so resonant. I observed, boys, that were around me, growing up around me, that had those expectations put on them,
Mhm.
and how harmful it is. So again, thank you for writing this book. And this is again so important. And I was just wondering, since you've been doing this work, you've been immersed in this work for a lifetime, but in having conversations around patriarchal masculinity, you've been doing it for more than 5 or so years. How has the conversation about masculinity, about this topic, how has it evolved?
Oh, I have been the most excited for this question. For so many reasons. I think that I don't typically use the term healthy masculinity. I know it's a popular term. And the reason why I usually don't use it is because I think one of the things that's happening often people refer to this work as men's work. One of the things that I think happens in men's work is that we are replacing one box, a box that, of course, is toxic, for another box that is healthier. But I think the point is that we get to create our own box and no one gets to create that for us. And I think one of the things that is happening is that there is a culture of we need to teach men how to be masculine. And one of the things I say in the book is that I'm not necessarily here to tell someone what masculinity needs to look like for them. Because, of course, there are multiple masculinities. Masculinity can be whatever we want it to be. And I think one of the things that needs to evolve is thinking that a healthier masculinity just means that men have to cry, right? I think it's more about men not being shamed for cry. It's not to say that men can no longer like sports, drink beer, or do other things that are associated with masculinity, but more so about getting people to re-examine the rules and be able to see the rules that are harmful, and being able to rethink these rules. I think a lot of what I hope this book makes people think about is why do they do the things that they do, and figure out, are these things contributing to living a wholer, more peaceful, more loving life, or are they not? I think another thing that has to evolve is I think we have to see there has to be more intersectionality in this space, where I think that we want to talk, we meaning like other men's work folks, I think we want to talk about masculinity, but we don't want to talk about racism. Right. And I think that patriarchy and white supremacy have always gone hand in hand. And we have to think about, if we're talking about American masculinity, like this is something that white men got to determine. This is not something that like men of color got to create the rules of. Like this is the groups in power created the rules. And I think that if we're not also addressing racism, because part of a patriarchal masculine identity is racism, is white supremacy. I think that's seen in the founding of our country, the folks who and other systems of oppression, right? Like I think those who had the right to vote, it wasn't just white men. You had to be a white man who owned land. So you had to be a rich white man. You couldn't be a poor white man. So I think we have to see how this work intersects across identities. And then the last thing that I'll say, and this is going to sound funny, it's almost going to sound like a contradiction. I think there's also a need for us to not co opt feminism. And the reason why I say that is a lot of men are invested in rethinking their ideas about masculinity as long as the ideas that they're rethinking benefit them and keep them in power. I guess what I mean by that is a lot of men are invested in talking about mental health. They're invested in talking about their emotions. They think these are good things. Now, if we're talking about ridding them of the power that comes with being a man, I think a lot of people aren't interested in that. I think people don't want to talk about the harm that their masculinity is doing. And I think we're in a space where we almost need to decenter men, where we need to, yes, acknowledge that patriarchy harms all members of our community, but we have to be clear about who does it harm the most. And we have to be very honest about not just co-opting feminism and taking it to just benefit men, but also like getting back to this is about equity for all folks, like regardless of gender, and being able to see that we still have power, we still have privilege, and we just because we are um uh I don't know if victim's the right word that I want to use, but just because we are harmed by patriarchy does not mean that we don't still benefit from it. In the same way that white people are also harmed by white supremacy, and they sure as heck still do benefit from it. So it's kind of a both and that I think is needed right now in a lot of conversations, because the focus right now can be so much on let's talk about men's mental health. Men need to share their emotions. All I agree with that completely. And let's talk about how we benefit from this social system. And let's talk about what would it look like for us to divest from patriarchy's power. Like, what would it look like for us to give up power in spaces where we have it? What does it look like for us in meetings to unmute ourselves and say, actually, she wasn't done talking yet? Or what would it look like for us to say, hey, you just mansplained something? She just said that, right? So I think that's a part of the conversation that I think we're starting to stray away from because we're so focused on, we are centering how men are harmed in many spaces. And that is a reflection of patriarchy. It is a reflection of the idea that men are the most important population. Therefore, we need to be the most concerned about their issues. So sorry, I think that was a long-winded, but I think this is something I've been really critical of recently because a lot of people are engaging in conversations about masculinity, redefining it. I don't even like saying redefining it because I don't believe masculinity needs to be defined. Um, so I think we just need to be careful that we are not co-opting this movement and reinforcing patriarchy in the way that we talk about the issues with patriarchal masculinity.
Yeah, and that requires a lot more unpacking, Destin, but definitely so important to kind of remind that, remind the folks that you're having conversations with, you're working with people in the men's work movement that of the harms and being able to engage more, as you mentioned, in sort of intersectionality work,
Mhm.
right? And really identifying power structures that are harmful to everyone. I appreciated what you said about sort of the white supremacy and how that shows up in patriarchy, right? Like
Mhm. Mhm.
white men were we're able to define what patriarchy is about. And that kind of leads connected to my earlier questions about, part of, sort of decolonization movement is unlearning whiteness, for many of us in the diaspora. And what I mentioned earlier about, you know, so much of what you've written, what you talk about, resonates with people from, different communities, right? Different communities of color, even immigrant communities, because again, with our the colonial structures have been defined by whiteness and white supremacy. So appreciate that. And so I'm down to my last question, which is, this work is really calling out patriarchy and toxic masculinity, and it absolutely must continue, right? And in the ways that you mentioned should evolve. And you alluded to this earlier about the social political environment that we're in and what
Mhm.
you're noticing, what we are seeing. Um, what are you most hopeful about?
Oof, I love this question so much, and I have to share why I love it. I think hope is a difficult thing to have sometimes. And one of the things that I've been thinking about more recently is how hope is also a form of resistance. And I think about how systems of oppression work to strip everything away from the people that they oppress, specifically their hope. And I think about how when we hope, when we dream, that we take that power back in many ways. One of the way that I was thinking about this, I have to share, then I promise I'll answer the question, is when I got married, me and my wife, we jumped the broom, a tradition that comes from slavery where, folks wanted to get married. They couldn't legally get married because they were barely considered humans. So that just, there was a tradition created of someone would lay down a broom. And once you jump over that broom with your partner, you are considered married. Now, as I went through that experience, kind of like honoring my ancestors, I thought about, wow, how dare they had the hope to fall in love? How dare they have the hope to often choose to have children? Like not knowing what their destiny or future would be. And I was like, wow, that is like a radical form of resistance. So I appreciate this question on hope because I think that sometimes we stray away from looking to hope. So I'll first answer why I'm struggling to have hope and then where I have hope. One of the things I'm struggling with is I do feel like patriarchal masculinity played a huge role in this past election. And I think about like the misogyny and I think about we could talk about it all day. And I think about how many younger men um, were influenced by red pill masculinity, and that there's like there's a movement right now emerging that's all about returning back to this like power based traditional patriarchal masculinity. um and I think where I feel hopeful is that so many men are starting to engage in these conversations. I recently joined the platform Threads, which does an interesting thing with algorithms. And every time I go on Threads, like I see a man saying that they want to start a podcast about redefining masculinity. And I'm like, wow, like there's so many people who are entering this space, and that gives me hope. But also, I think that I just also believe that young people, including like my generation, I still consider myself a young person. I'm like an elder in Gen Z, but I really believe that young people today are really about this life. And what I mean is, I think that they are not afraid to resist. I think that they are asking great questions that I didn't know to ask. I think they are more curious about their identity and who they are. But I also just love to see that for some young people, these things don't matter. you know, like I think it really just depends place to place, culture to culture, community to community. But I've definitely been in some spaces where young people are just kind of like, yeah, I just want to do what I want. And I'm like, period. You should do what you want. So that gives me hope. Um, And I think another thing that gives me hope, kind of related to this book, and maybe it's a place where the work has to evolve, but I still think conversations about masculinity are dominated by white men. I think it is mostly white men who are present in this space. And I think there is such a need for more men of color to talk about masculinity because for us, this is different. Like, I think one of the drastic ways and why I talk about race so much in this book is that my maleness contributes to my I experience power and in oppression based on my maleness in the same body. I think about how my black manhood is seen as a threat to white masculinity, how it is seen as a threat to whiteness. I experience people crossing the street to not have me behind them and all of these things. And all of that is tied to my identity as a man. But going back to hope, I think there's so many men in my community who have responded well to this book who I didn't think would. And I think it feels a little weird to say that something I wrote gives me hope, but it does because more people are open to the conversation. And I think there's a need for us to set aside our elitism and our ego and start talking about this stuff in ways that people can connect to. Um, so I think one of the things that was important for me is, of course, saying patriarchy, saying feminism. Like, I'm not saying we erase these words completely, but we got to talk about what do these words mean, and we have to break them down in ways that all people can understand. So that's something that has been giving me hope is just seeing people be open to this conversation.
And that's what's really powerful about your narrative and the way that you engage in this conversation, Destin, is that you're able to model all of those great, wonderful things to be able to bring people into the conversation, even though they may not have, prior knowledge about, the definitions or maybe may have some, preconceived notions about what they are. But so thank you. And those are all the questions I have. Is there anything else you would like to share?
Yes, I just want to add one quick thing to the last thought. In the book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? I believe it's Dr. Beverly Tatum, I believe. Um, in I think the opening chapter of the book, she's talking about racism and she says something that is powerful that I think I want to leave folks with. And she always talks about when people would ask her if reverse racism exists, she would say, "Well, tell me how you define racism." And that is one of the wisest things that I've ever read because if we don't take time to define terms, we might find ourselves talking about two completely different things. And I think one of the things I've noticed is that when we say words like patriarchy, feminism, or even masculinity, a lot of people don't know we're not always using the same definitions of these words. So I think it's important for folks who are looking to engage in these conversations around patriarchal masculinity, even the intention of saying patriarchal masculinity. There's meaning and reason behind that because our words do matter and our definitions matter because they vary. Um, there are many definitions I've read or I've heard people talk about patriarchy and describe it in completely different ways. So it's always important to make sure that we ground any conversation in the definitions behind what we are talking about.